open the floor for questions. You can take a round of questions. Identify yourself.
Mike Alunan, former student already back UP days. Anyway, little bother when the concepts raised. There was not discussion value, even value, raise value as creative people, no? And Alex also mentioned, Professor Alex also mentioned value, seemingly detached already from the physical. I mean, in its even talking about the modern market, and because the entire discussions of the system or from history, there was no discussion much on, let's say, the real value, physical value throughout which caused or created the upswings and downswings of the economy. Like for instance, there were significant periods in history, like 1971 exchange rate deregulation, time of Nixon, then 1989, Glass-Steagall was repealed, time of Clinton, wherein the banks, the Wall Street, liberalized to a point that banks can now trade even pension plans of employees and all that, to a point that it has now ballooned so much that you have value is now value of money has been given too much value when in fact money per se has no intrinsic value. So there's been a dichotomy of the ballooning of value as it's perceived to be has value when in fact it has no physical sense. And it's, I guess, that's causing all the crisis and chaotic in the markets that so all three somehow discuss value in its their own perspective, or so I don't know how. Just comment.
Yeah, thank you. Let me respond to a few points that have been addressed very well by to the viewers and yourself. First, on the issue of value, Marx made a very clear distinction between use value and exchange value. Use value, of course, is I think what we are really talking about. The creative, meaningful, useful, of course, something that enhances human life. And it takes many forms, intellectual, nurturing, etc., etc. All of that is value. Unfortunately, the logic of capitalism is not there. The logic of capitalism is on exchange value, which means that anything at all that can be sold in the market for a profit, which is surplus value, that is what matters. And so, in that sense, capitalism does not really pay attention to what is the real value of what it is they are producing. Rather, what is the surplus value that they can get out of it, which is their source of profit. Now, the fact that we are talking about different values shows precisely that we are at that stage where we should really be thinking of a new system. It's clear that we cannot expect capitalism to deliver on what we want. And the thing is, capitalism is now having a real crisis of value, of surplus value. They have a problem in profits. The rate of profit is going down, and therefore they are unable to carry on with their gain. One way to do it is financialization, and this is the point you are making now. We have seen it happen before. Britain, from being manufacturer of the world, became banker to the world. Now, with the decline of productive investment in manufacturing and so on, we go into financialization. And what you said is absolutely correct. There is a decoupling. They call it a decoupling. There was a severance of the financial world from the real world. money just became money, floating. The U.S. is now one way for the U.S. to address its debt problem, aside from pushing it to China and the rest of the world, is to print more money. So that in that case, really, money is becoming less and less valuable. It's losing its value. And the use of money to put some price or value to things. Look what happened in Japan. It came out to a point where real estate values in Japan just did not make sense at all. That there's a square. I was living in Tokyo at that time, and I just couldn't believe that the footprint of the house I was living in was more valuable than an entire town in California. You know, I mean, that's that kind of totally illogical. And that just shows to you how illogical the system is. Now, the real problem now is that there is so much money moving around, so much liquidity, we don't know what to do with it. They're pushing it for debts. The problem with that is that, okay, you are able to make use of it for a while, but you have to pay it back. And when you can't pay it back, the whole thing comes crashing down. And that is why it is not totally surprising that the banks came crashing down during the Obama administration, following the Bush administration, you mentioned it a while ago, which precipitated the decline of American dollar. So there is this decoupling of the financial world from the material productive world that is true, and I don't know what capitalism can really do about it.
Yeah. Right now, you see,
Yeah. Then I think Alex asked the question, is there one unified logic that overrides all? It does not override all. And that's the good thing about it. Capitalism has a tremendous domination over the world with its logic of capital. But even that is not able to obliterate other logics that are operative at the human level. For instance, they talk about the informal economy. They talk about the natural economy. They talk about the home and the household and so on. Capitalism has tried to make an inroad into this but has not been able to totally penetrate. In other words, the cash nexus, money for everything, does not operate here. It is perhaps out of these countervailing logics that we can put things together in an anti-systemic way. The feminist movement, the ethnic movements, cultural movements all over the world that's happening, and they seem chaotic because they seem to be going on almost sporadically. You have the Arab Spring, you have the sit-down movements and so forth and so on. These are all anti-systemic movements which at this stage of development are still disunited, maybe not knowing each other. The question was raised a while ago, is there one place on earth where somehow we can put things together? I don't know if anyone here, I don't know if you have been to Porto Alegre, if you have attended any of this World Future, what do you call it? Alternative? World Social Forum. Well, for all that you may be able to criticize it, and I am not in a position to criticize it one way or the other because I've never been there, but it seems to be one venue where these different anti-systemic movements, feminist, racial, cultural, are coming together. And maybe it will take some time still before some kind of movement of movements can cohere. It's really very difficult for us thinking now as to what kind of system we want, what kind of system should take over. We only know that capitalism has shown its, it has shown its tremendous capacity to do things, but now it has shown its inability to provide us with what really we want. And it's putting us in a system that challenges and threatens the very foundations of our existence. Alex mentioned something about mobility, which is true. Really, the world now is tremendous rates of mobility. Capital moves, it crosses frontiers. Knowledge, yes, very fast, as fast as the internet can get to you. But labor is still hampered. Okay, of course, we have lots of Filipinos abroad, but look, they need visas, they need papers, they can be thrown out, they can be deported, there are limits, they are illegal. I don't know how many millions of Filipinos are abroad illegally. That only shows that the limitations, state limitations are there. It's not like capital. I mean, capital can always extract concessions, and especially now with neoliberalization, where all controls, monetary controls and everything, have fallen apart, and capital is free to go. Which again shows the tremendous power of capital over others. The system of theory in crisis. I was almost sure that Alex would say here the world system theory in crisis. I'm glad he didn't. But it is, yes, the crisis of the world is posing a real challenge to all the theories that we have. I'm not saying that world system theory explains it better than others. I just think that, in my way of thinking, of course, it explains a lot more of phenomena in a more consistent way, within a more, shall I say, unified framework of analysis. It cannot explain everything, and it will have weaknesses here or there. But within the premises of the theoretical system, I think that we can explain the decline of U.S. Power, that is political and geostrategic. We can explain the resurgence of counter movements like fundamentalist Islam, that is cultural. We can explain the rise of China and the disappearance of Haiti. They were saying, there's not just the third world, there's also the fourth world, which has even no place inside in the system. They are out. Haiti is one of those. And yet, if you went back to the 1800s, Haiti was right there. Haiti was a tremendous source of surplus, of profit. That was where all the plantations were. But it became useless, so it's thrown out. So it's not even part of the third world, it's fourth world. You see, there are all those, I wouldn't agree, Alex, that it is monocausal reasoning, because there are different, all these, cultural, political, economic, social, can be understood within the framework of the system. Maybe I would agree that it is economic primarily. Well, that is also what we say about Marxism, that it's economic determinism, it's materialism, it's historical materialism. And that's our theoretical basis. It has its limitations, but using it, we can go as far as we can, not more than that, in analyzing historical and contemporary events. I don't know, other people might want to say more.
I just lost my notes, that's what happened. Okay. I just wanted to react to the question of exchange value and use value. I really think that these two are increasingly decoupled in the world system now of the economy, and I think that's why we might be going into a crisis that many people are saying are is unsolvable, it keeps coming back, why there is a reset, because I think the logic of what's on the table, there always had been this juncture, as you point out, between the creation of value that people really can use, like, and communicate with, can work with, can live with or need, against just what value you can exchange. But it may well be that we're at that stage where this juncture is so wide that the classic solutions of the crisis, the endless crisis of capitalism, is really no longer working. So that's the first. I think, for me, from the point of view of feminist economics, I think what is clear why that we may be at that stage is somewhere where I disagree with Alex. I really don't think that there ever was a time when you could just do intellectual work. I think that is a perceptive, a trick of classification that capitalism also has been doing to gain maximum profit, which is essentially splitting the mind from the body, devaluing the work of the body. So you have manual labor as opposed to intellectual labor. You have reproductive work as opposed to supposedly productive work. When actually the economy is both manual labor, intellectual labor. And Marx, for example, argues very cogently that it's merely a capitalist trick. And in fact says that it's the manual labor of the worker using both mind and body that produces the real value, di ba? Yun ang sinasabi niya. So that has continued in classic economics, and both in the theoretical sense and in the way we value things. But the truth of the matter is, even Tolkien's intellectual work would be nothing if it did not produce pleasure. It is not the intellectualism, or not just the intellectualism of Tolkien, that is valuable. It's the pleasure that was produced by the work. And that would be increasingly true if you look at it. I will make a final point about that. When you look at the way we're cooperatively coming together to produce pleasure, so I'll just continue to use that term, to keep front and center the point I'm trying to make as a feminist, that the bodies and pleasures are never separate from the creation of value, is the idea of real estate and location. Location is everything. Diba? If I took this room and put it in a really remote place, the value of the material things in this room would be no different from the value of it now. But certainly we could not be able to sell this room at the same price. At ang dahilan doon is because this room is in UP. And that is where the value of it lies. Not the place, but the social relations, conditions, the cool factor of it being in UP. The pleasure of personal relationships, the sensuality of being on the campus. I'm being a bit provocative, but I want you to keep front and center that value. Yeah, it's not exactly the most sensual. This kind. You grew up here. But I'm putting that front and center because I really want to make that point. That from the very beginning, spurious naman talaga yung mind and body, pleasure, work, production and reproduction divisions ng kapitalismo. Pero ngayon, talagang the dehiscence has gone so far that it is very, very clear that what is creating value are these things. What makes us come together, what makes us communicate, the pleasure of the Facebook, the coming together. What is increasingly important is
what Marx has always said, that value is not created by the single individual working someplace. Sabi niya, people are always social beings in praxis. And we are seeing that front and center now. The creative, common work of ordinary people is really what is creating value. And capitalism cannot tap into it anymore. It's primitive accumulation is their way of, they're stealing things from us. That's the only way the capitalist system is surviving. It's stealing land. It's stealing MWSS. It's stealing, ganun na eh. Primitive accumulation na yan. Hindi naman yan capitalist, accumulation eh. That's how it's coping as well as financialization. The taking back of the workers' wins for the welfare system. It's taking it back, and that's how it's also coping.
I think you misunderstood what I was trying to say, Robert Wright. Sabi ni Robert Wright,
To you for the last 30 years.
hindi naman sila disconnected. Yung manual, symbolic yung symbolic analyst, sinasabi lang niya, yung wealth creation curve ng symbolic analyst, mas mataas. Kasi he can reproduce his own product. Halimbawa, hindi naman intellectual work. Halimbawa, sa lahat sa atin dito, sigurado, pinakamalaking kita si Ted Pailon. Kasi, ito, daldal tayo ng daldal dito, ilan lang nakikinig sa atin. No? Si Ted Pailon, kahit basura sinasabi nun, daang libo naman ang nakikinig sa kanya. So yun yung tinatawag na symbolic analyst kasi nagagamit niya yung information technology para ma-reproduce yung units ng kanyang output. No? And therefore, the capitalist system, if you want to call it that, rewards him better than us. Usap tayo ng usap dito ng di ba? Wala tayong hihitain dito. Yun lang ang sinasabi ko, hindi siya magkahiwalay yung manual at intellectual. Sa intellectual, kaya nga ang ginamit ng term symbolic analyst. Kasi it's not necessarily intellectual work. It could be junk, but junk that sells. Angry Birds or whatever. Which, by the way, has been valued. Nakita ko sa Bloomberg, some ridiculous amounts. I think $2.3 billion.
Measurable yan kaya okay sa mga kaibigan.
Pero ang nag-a-assign ng value is the number of utility units you're able to project your product to.
Just like one last round.
I'm Claudio from the Peripheral University down the road. I just want to pick up on the comparison between Britain in decline and America in decline, both financializing. But it seems to me that in the latter case, you can examine that through the classic Marxist commodity fetish. In other words, people don't see the processes of production happening because it's been outsourced, i.e. by imperialism, everything's happening in India. But the financialization of the United States is precisely happening through fantasy. They're both, before that, the similarity is that they're both responses rather to a lack in demand. But in the latter half, the way you respond to demand is through fantasy, through debt, through credit default swaps, and through these other things, which really detaches the production of capital from material production. I don't know if you read yesterday, there was an article in the New York Times saying, why I quit Goldman and Sachs. And that's because people, even within Goldman and Sachs, nakikita na nila, na dinedenggoy na nila yung mga sarili nilang kliyente. So I think that actually, I want to ask if we have a grammar to understand this within sort of world systems theory or Marxist theory, because I don't think it's the fetish, because the fetish assumes that there are material processes of production, it's just that you don't see them because they're happening elsewhere, like in India. But here, that process is precisely projected to the sphere of fantasy by virtue of speed and by virtue of mobility. So I wonder if there's a new grammar that can emerge from within our progressive thinking. Thank you.
The second round of questions.
Kasi Walang drama, no? Walang ligwahe. No? Kaya tuloy napipilitan tayo, mabalik tayo kay Lenny, natanda na doon, no? Tsaka nakalbo na yun. Halimbawa, ano ba yung crisis ng, yung Greek crisis, no? Halimbawa, ano ba yung nature ng Greek economy? Diba? Yung nature ng Greek economy, ang laking percentage ng income yan galing sa turismo. Eh, anong kapital nila ron? Yung kapital nila ron, yung mga lumang pinagtatayo 4,000 years ago, di ba? Yung mga pantheon, kung ano-ano. Yun lang. Of course, they sell some olives and olive oil, some feta cheese. Pero basically, di ba, you have this anomalous condition where this country is still trying to make money off the investments of their ancestors, 4,000 years ago. And the same way we're trying to do with our rice terraces. Doon yun ang kinikita ng Greece. Paano nagkaroon ng problema? Nagkaroon ng problema kasi ayaw magbayad ng buwis ng mga Greeks. Diba? Gusto mura yung tren, mura yung gasolina, mura lahat. No? Libre hospital, etc. So actually, niluutang ng gobyerno. Kasi wala namang investment in new wealth creation yung Greece. Kaya di ba, kahit mas malaki yung utang ng Italy as a percentage of its economy, hindi siya masyadong problema kasi kumikita sila, nagbebenta silang Fiat tsaka Giordano. No? Yung Greece, wala talaga. Di ba? Puro tamad doon. No? Umaasa sila sa puhunan ng kanilang mga ninuno. No? Yun basically yung pagkakaiba nila. No? Ngayon, yung debt crisis is simply a way of indicating that there has been no wealth creation. Yung wealth, nagdi-dissipate naman yan. Diba? Yung phone mo, naluluma yan. Nag-depreciate yung value. Nag-depreciate yung wealth. Pag hindi mo nilalampasan yan, na rate ng wealth creation faster than the rate of wealth dissipation, you end up with like the Greeks. No? Ngayon, the real controversial idea to introduce was, ngayon, dapat mangutang tayo. No? Dapat mangutang tayo. Diba? Kung imaginative lang yung policy making natin, finance policy making, bakit tayo dapat pangutang? Kasi ang interest rate, ang policy rates, bumagsak na sa 2.75%. No? Ang inflation rate, 3.75%. Pag nangutang ka, tubo ka kagad ng 1%. Diba? Bakit tayo dapat mangutang? Kasi merong mga tinatawag na mature economies. Yung mga mature economies, mas marami kang kapital na kailangan to create the same value. Kaya may problema yung Europe. No? Mature economy na siya. Diba? Whereas, yung tinatawag na emerging economies, a fraction of the capital will create the same wealth. No? Kaya may nagkakaroon ng net wealth transfer, particularly in a regime of low interest rates, low inflation. Bakit ba nagkukumahog yung mga European government sa mga kanong na i-control yung capital? No? Kasi yung capital na yan, kung pag hinayaan mo, parang tubig na wala sa baso, they will flow to the area of greatest return, which is here, for instance. If you know what to do with it. Kung hindi naman natin alam kung ano yung so pero huwag na lang. Dahil utang yun, no? Babayaran natin yun. Kung isa-subsidize din lang natin sa resort nila, doon tayo nagkautang-utang. Yung debt crisis natin, noong mid-80s, 75% doon dahil sa oil subsidy. Gusto ibalik na naman ngayon, di ba? It does not create wealth. Subsidy never creates wealth. So, if we rethink our options, kasi everything boils down, ano policy mo? No? Para sa bansa mo. how they arrive at a policy strategy. Baguhin niya yung mga kategorya mo. Tingnan mo, di ba? Hindi pwedeng moralistic ako tayo mangutang. Di ba? Masama yan. Kasalanan yan sa Diyos. So, halimbawa na yun. Ngayon, dapat tayong mangutang kasi makakagulang tayo. At labanan natin any move to control the financial sector. Kasi yun ang imperialistang panganak. Ang tawag doon. Yung capital regulation, controls. Kasi ngayon tayo makikinabang. Maring bukas, pag nagbago yung kondisyon, taas ang interest rates, baka yung controls makabuti sa atin. Diba? So, nothing is permanently good or bad. Configuration na yan, conjunctural. Ngayon, ang conjuncture, mangutang tayo hanggat maaari. No, please. Mag-deficit spending tayo hanggat maaari. Please, pero hindi mangyayari yun. Guys, there have no imagination.
That's anything? Okay.
No. Let's go first and then step one more and then.
So good afternoon, everybody. This is just going to be a light question or concern. So I'm Ian, a graduate student from the University of the Philippines. My question is just primarily conceptual question, because from the three discussions, what I mean is the insight that right now we are in a crisis. For example, we have the world system theory that sort of does not really give us explanatory power anymore in moving forward, i.e., from the table presented by Dr. Aseniero, there was a B phase, an A phase, and so on. If we're going to be really inductionist about it, you will predict that there's going to be another increase or another, a better ring of the story. So, but again, all three of the speakers were very, very cogent in telling us that the system actually needs to bifurcate. That, right now we're having a crisis. If we're going to be really kunyan about it, there ought to be a paradigm shift to really allow for what's happening empirically and conceptually. But I see that there's a problem there because number one, the question lingers is how does the world system theory actually react to the trend or to the phenomenon of regionalism or integration and cooperation among states. Although Dr. Aseniero again was able to highlight the world system theory is not about interstate relations. The common denominator that I see is that both the world system theory and even theories in IR actually sort of fail in trying to account for what's happening right now in the status quo. So the concern really is number one, what is our way about from here? Ought there to be a new paradigm to approach the whole thing altogether? Number two, we really just account for what's there and really just tweak it a bit. And number two or number three reflection would be a concern on as to really how much of the categorizing actually yields some utility at the end of the day. Because right now, what we again glean is that conceptually, there is something wrong with the system and that the system needs to really auto-program itself or auto-reset, in the words of Dr. Claudio. So again, the concern is how do we go from here?
Questions before last follow-up?
I'm a little bothered with some of the discussion, like the ones raised by Professor Alex. I think both systems extremes are faulty in some ways, like the capitalist free market system and the Marxist socialist. Like for instance, there was statement raised earlier that there's a crisis because there is the lack of capacity of the market to absorb the overproductive. And in fact, I think it's the contrary. The world economy and even local economies are not producing enough. And there's maybe probably glut in the consumer market on consumer products, but generally on production like infrastructures, power systems, the works, there's so much, there's a lot of that's lacking there. And like for instance, even locally, there are three sectors of the economy, like for instance, agriculture as a percent of total GDP has been declining over the last 3-4 decades from a peak of 30% of total GDP. It's now down to 15-16%. Industry has also continues to be declining. And what has been ballooning is the services. Although services are socially necessary, like education, communication, even arts, music, because they help enhance the creative powers of people, no? But there are certain aspects of services that are dubious of importance to society and the economy. For instance, when you go to any government building, there's an elevator boy, and as far as that is concerned, that's a job generation, so therefore counted as a contribution to the economy as part of the service sector. In fact, total economy, its consumption per se is about 80% of total GNP. So more and more are now sharing the same pie, yeah, but not much food producing. So that's my and same with excellent.
Globally or
Even globally, or even in the case of Greece, no, you said wealth creation, of course they needed that, but it's actually the free market and too much debt actually killed their local, the trades, only production.
Very quick response to a few of the questions. Just want to say something about the Greek problem. Here is a case where Greece should really be part of the semi-periphery, coming into elite membership in the core. And that is important. Sarkozy said something which the Greeks, of course, didn't like. He said they were not prepared for this. They doctored their documents. They showed that they were already here, but they never know that. True. They belong to the semi-periphery. The activities that Alex mentioned are not core activities. These are not leading industries. These are, and competitive. People can go to Egypt, to India, to China, to Mexico, anywhere else in the world. So it's not monopolistic. And therefore, that's for that reason that entrance of Greece into the Eurozone was a disaster waiting to happen, and it did happen. Very good point about primitive accumulation. Actually, Samir Amin is using a different term now. He calls it primitive dispossession. Primitive dispossession. You are not accumulating capital, you are just dispossessing people of their rights, of the commons, of space, of water, earth. I mean, commodification, I did not mention it here, but commodification is the process by which more and more things are produced for exchange value, never mind if they are useful. And the trend of capitalism has been to commodify more and more, what Wallerstein calls commodification of everything. That means land has been before, and now it is privatized, of course, long ago. The sea, space, outer space, with the satellites and everything. Africa, and even the military is privatized now in the US. I mean, we have the private, whatever you call it. Yeah, everything is privatized, right? But there are limits, and this is just the point to the question. Why is it that world system does not seem to have an answer to this? It's because they're saying that we have reached the asymptotes of expansion. In other words, take this to be the limit. I've reached here, I can't go any further. Well, number one, natural resources. I didn't get the chance to talk about it, but natural resources are finite. The ability of nature to renew itself is far below the rate at which we are using nature now. So in fact, there are real limits to expansion, which are in the physical world. Oil, we have reached peak oil. We cannot go any further. It's a big question whether China, and this is the point that this guy is saying, China cannot continue at the same rate that it's doing. It will deplete resources all over the world. The world is finite, and capitalism has no logic for finiteness. It is endless accumulation of capital. And therefore, there are no limits anymore. That's why it's very difficult to imagine that there will be, of course, Alex mentioned it actually, the new technologies, information and so on. It's giving a boost, but how far you can go? Does it drive enough? Does it bring enough the rest of the economy for it? What does it cost to produce a little thing like this? You know, it's true. The value is tremendous. The use value of this thing is tremendous. The surplus value is not much. Nokia is in trouble. Nokia was a world giant not so long ago. Now it's in trouble. Why?
Before long, they will finish.
Finish. The finish will be finished. So that's just to show that there are asymptotes, there are real limits to growth. This is not ideological, it's scientific, it's the reality of the situation. And that's why all of our thinking, this process that's going on now, is very creative thinking, and it's wonderful to hear all this discussion. It's really alternatives, talk about network alternative systems, what they can be. Now, it's not that the national unit is finished. Okay, we were thought for a while that it was really the framework by which, we could move forward for uplift. And then we realized that there are real limits to national capacities to do anything. But, nation states can go together in regional blocks. You mentioned this regional block. Well, we should be doing that because the center is doing it. Wallerstein and others, and long ago they already been saying it, that there will be a different axis, a different reconfiguration of hegemonic power, where the US will probably come closer to East Asia, China and Japan, on the one hand, and Europe goes closer to Russia on the other. And where are we? Well, we should have our groupings too. This is where I think, if I may say, third world studies, I don't want to change this name, Alex. It's a nice name. I think we know what it means. I think a program of research for third world studies is precisely to look for alternatives, to look at regional groupings, how we can reach out to which partners elsewhere. It doesn't have to be regional in the sense of geographic region. It could be in terms precisely of anti-systemic movements all over the world, and again, that's the value of Porto Alegre. Yeah, I think I am there. Thank you.
Next, ang last one is Amen.
I wanted to deal with, pero masyadong haba yan about paradigms or whatever. Siguro, pinaka-basic, kung natin gamitin yung paradigms, yung conceptual framework na ginagamit should allow intervention. Should allow you to intervene. Not to disable you from intervening. Kaya kumisa, but then magiging mystical yung paliwanag mo kasi, di ba? Pwede puro Marxismo nga yan, tama yan. Pero it disables you from intervening. Reactionary yun. Kailangan yung paliwanag mo allows you to intervene in your time and place. So, di ba? Diba, binanggit ko kanina, mahutang tayo, di ba? In which case, labanan natin yung controls sa liquidity flow. In which case, to be neoliberal today is revolutionary. Bakit bukas hindi? Pero ngayon, tubo tayo natin.
I just wanted to answer the question of where we are from here. Kasi, ang tingin ko, ang crisis capitalism, and because we're so much part of it, we are in crisis, diba? But that has to be taken as a very nuance because the working majority of the world have no interest in what capitalism wants. Now I'm sounding classically Marxist, but anyway, in that sense, the real question is where we go from here. Diba? How do we get not out there? How do we push the bifurcation? Kumbaga. And ako, kung hiram din naman ako ng pera, diba? Kung hiram din naman ako ng pera, gagamitin ko for things that will make our people productive in the new economy. And now it will sound, that sounds funny, but that's universal healthcare and universal education. Kasi tingin ko, kung ang world economy ngayon ay kaisipan, diba? Creation of ideas, the participation in networks of creative, cooperative work, then we really have to invest in the education. And I think in that sense, oo, bakit? Diba? Mangungutang din naman ako. Bigyan mo ako 250 billion, may universal healthcare na ako tomorrow. Tahan ko na lang. Ewan ko kung ano yung magkano yung education, diba? Pero in that sense, we have a competitive advantage, I don't want to use that term as a capitalist, an advantage, kasi ang mahalaga ngayon, even China is seeing this sa kanilang pagtingin sa education system nila. Alam nila na hanggang hindi sila magkaroon ng education system that produce out-of-the-box thinkers, like Steve Jobs, whom I don't admire, they'll continue to produce the iPhones that someone else designs and thinks about. So they're trying to get out of the quadrado system and they're really having a hard time. Diba? While those of us in UP have been doing this for the past 100 years. So if we could do that, if we could really invest in our capacity of people to live meaningful and happy lives and ready them for what is already happening, which is the creation of cooperative systems of pressure and creativity. That's one way, no? Ano yung magiging role ng gobyerno aside from this? Tingin ko nga, creating common standards for these systems. Yung internet, halimbawa, napakalaki na kailangan ng IT policy natin para uniform yan sa bayan, para accessible yan sa mga tao, para yung democratic nature ng internet ay ma-inculcate sa mga website ng gobyerno, yung interactive nature ng capacity ng internet for democracy. Diba? Para sigurado tayo na kahit local lang maging control of economies and whatever, even utility companies, iisa yung grid, whether internet yan o tubig. Diba? Even as we will continue to try to localize, even organic markets are important, but if you don't have standards for organic food, this would be the role of the government, diba? To help those systems of creativity and environmental protection, etc., etc. And I think that the other way around is for to have us a financial, kung local yun, yung ating stance internationally, has to be in line with what are the fact that we are a sending country, and we should insist on certain rights of global citizenship that would include healthcare, wherever you are, whether you're a citizen of that country or not, diba? And some basic things like your right to your national identity, the right of your children to a name. Ito, napakahalaga sa foreign policy initiative naman, kung magiging bayan tayo na naka-attune na dun sa possible future natin. So, ang last na sasabihin ko, nahihirapan ako sa wealth creation na term. Kaya babalikan ko yung tema ko yung buong maghapon. Ang mahalaga siguro, well-being and pleasure creation. Yan yung ipilit natin because we will not be in crisis if we continue to look at development frameworks within that rather than thinking about wealth.